So back when I was just writing out reviews for my Tumblr and reposting them to my Facebook, every once in a while I'd review two similar films and then do one ridiculously long post where I'd compare and contrast the two movies and talk about which film I thought told their story best. I did that for White House Down and Olympus Has Fallen. I did that for The Raid Redemption and Dread. And I did that for Superman Returns and Man of Steel. And now I'd like to do that for two films about our 36th president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. All the way based on the play by Robert Schenken, directed by Jay Roach, who previously did the Austin Powers films, Meet the Parents, Meet the Fockers, and the critically acclaimed drama Trumbo, which led to Bryan Cranston getting an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor in 2016. And LBJ, directed by Rob Reiner, known for his directing work such as This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men, and The Bucket List. Except I'm going to save you a couple hours of your life and several hours of my life and just skip straight to comparing the two. So, without further ado, take it away, Pharaoh.
It's time to do.
All the Way stars Bryan Cranston as President Johnson, while Woody Harrelson portrays the titular president in LBJ. And honestly, they both do a pretty good job. In fact, both films have a couple similar scenes. In All the Way, we see Lyndon getting measured by his tailor for a new pair of pants, and Lyndon specifically mentions that he wants some extra room in his crotch because he apparently, he had big feet, if you know what I mean. In LBJ, we have a pretty early scene where Lyndon is on the phone with his tailor, and he asks for a new pair of pants with more room for his manhood. Then a few scenes later, in LBJ, we see Johnson talking to a few of his assistants while he's in the bathroom taking a dump, with the door wide open. And then we see the same scene play out in All the Way, with Lyndon talking poor Hubert Humphrey's ear off about how to get the Civil Rights Bill out of committee while taking a dump. And in All the Way, we have a scene where Lyndon tells Dr. Martin Luther King a story about why he specifically supports civil rights. That being that his personal cook, Zephyr Wright, travels down to Texas from D.C. for him every few months to check up on his ranch and everything. And every single time, whenever she needs to use the restroom, she has to pull off onto the side of the road to do her business in the middle of a field because she's not allowed to use the rest areas because she's black. He tells the same story to JFK's cabinet members in LBJ when he says he wants to push for civil rights, and they all assumed he was against it. There's even a bit in LBJ where someone's telling Lyndon that the vice presidency is a thankless job, and Lyndon replies, "So was being a school teacher in Cotulla, Texas." And we see All the Way expand on that, with Lyndon actually telling a story to the press about when he was a teacher in Cotulla. Both versions even have some of that infamous Johnson treatment, like in an early scene where Lyndon is still the majority leader, and he's asking the majority whip how many votes they have for a bill they're about to vote on. When the whip replies they have about 58 instead of just saying they have 58, Johnson asks him how nervous they'd be if he told the man to set his 2-inch pecker on the table and that he was going to swing a hatchet about 2 inches from the edge. The whip admits he'd be pretty darn nervous. Johnson replies that's how he feels when the whip says they have about 58 votes and tells him to go out and check the damn votes again. All the Way shows us the opposite of that, though. There's a scene where Lyndon hops onto an elevator with a southern senator who's pro-segregation, and Lyndon bribes him to take a trip up to Europe to visit the troops with his wife when the Civil Rights Bill comes up for a vote. That way, the bill can pass, and it won't be the senator's fault, because he'll have been out visiting the men who keep our country safe. He even throws in his presidential cufflinks as a bonus. And then once the senator leaves, Lyndon asks one of his aides to get him a new pair of cufflinks. Between the two of them, I think I prefer Cranston over Harrelson, just because we get a little more insight into why this Lyndon really wants civil rights. He tells a story about how after he graduated, he became an elementary school teacher in Cotulla, a small town near the U.S.-Mexico border, and most of the kids he taught were, of course, Mexican immigrants. And what he really loved about these poor kids is, even though they would always come in hungry because they hadn't had breakfast yet, they were always so ready and eager to learn. And then there'd come a day where Lyndon would always see that light in their eyes die down, because these innocent kids had just discovered that the world hated them for no reason at all, except for the fact that they were brown instead of white. And you can see Lyndon's heart break while he tells the story to the reporters on the White House lawn. It's really great acting from Bryan Cranston. Woody Harrelson does a really good job here too, but unfortunately the script and the runtime don't really give us much to empathize with him over, save for maybe the scene where Lyndon flat out asks Bobby Kennedy why doesn't he like him, despite the fact that John and their father both like him, which is a good scene, but someone venting about why someone else doesn't like them just isn't anywhere near as powerful as a teacher talking about the heartbreak of seeing their students realize that the world hated them. 1 point for all the way. Besides Lyndon Johnson himself, there are 3 characters that appear in both films. Lyndon's wife Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon's executive assistant Walter Jenkins, and Senator Dick Russell of Georgia. In All the Way, these characters are played respectively by Melissa Leo, Todd Weeks, and Frank Langella. And in LBJ, they are played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, C. Thomas Howell, and Richard Jenkins, respectively as well. This one is pretty easy to call in my opinion. While Jennifer does a pretty good job, she's just not given the material that Miss Leo is. All Jennifer as Lady Bird really gets to do is encourage Lyndon as best she can. Miss Leo does that too, but she also gets to call Lyndon out when he's being ridiculous. There's a pretty funny scene in All the Way where Lyndon is curled up in bed crying about how the entire world is against him, and Lady Bird is trying to soothe him, telling him that there's plenty of people in the White House, at the convention, and all around the country who love and support him. And Lyndon says, "I'm going to resign." And Lady Bird is just like, "No, you are not." And there's even a scene where she blatantly defies Lyndon, albeit in the sweetest possible way that only a woman like Lady Bird Johnson could do. When Lyndon's assistant Walter is caught having a relationship with another man in a YMCA restroom, Lyndon is ready to throw him to the wolves because he needs to win the damn election, and this is bad press. Lady Bird, however, insists on making a supportive statement because she and Lyndon have both known Walter for years, and this has to be a pretty difficult moment for him. Point for All the Way. C. Thomas Howell is given practically nothing to do in LBJ. He's a good actor, but he's saddled with a role that literally has no meat to it. He's just asked to do Lyndon's bidding for the most part. There's one scene where Walter tries to argue that Lyndon shouldn't take the VP position with Kennedy because there's no power in it, and if he stays where he is, whether Kennedy wins or not, he'll be one of the most powerful Democrats in the country. And he turns out to be right. Meanwhile, though, Todd Weeks as Walter is probably one of the most important characters in All the Way. At one point, Lyndon even says he's like a son to him, and you really believe he means it. He's still doing basically whatever he's told to by Lyndon, but there's also an intimacy to his presence. When Lyndon is in a bad mood for some reason and shouts at Lady Bird and she runs out crying, Walter runs after her to make sure she's okay. And Lady Bird admits that while it hurt for him to do that to her, she knows it's what she signed on for and that he really does love her. There's a scene where Lyndon admits to Walter while heading off to bed for the night that he doesn't genuinely want power, he just wants to help people. That's all. And he asks for Walter to lie down next to him on the bed before he goes to sleep. Walter even takes Lyndon's glasses off him while he's lying down. It really is clear that Lady Bird and Lyndon view Walter as their family and vice versa, which is why it really hurts all the more when we see Lyndon try to leave Walter behind for his sex scandal. Point goes to all the way. Senator Richard Russell Jr. was Lyndon's mentor in the Senate. He taught him the ins and outs of the job when he entered the Senate in '49, and was widely considered one of the most powerful Democrats in Washington, D.C., if not the most powerful. And both Richard Jenkins and Frank Langella do a fantastic job of showing off how much weight they carry among their peers. There's a scene in LBJ where Lyndon, as vice president, is talking with Richard, who mentions that JFK may be the president now, but he's been in the Senate for over 20 years, and he's battled 3 other presidents on civil rights and won. He'll be more than happy to bury another civil rights bill. He's almost gleeful at the prospect of humiliating this young upstart from New England. Langella's Richard Russell, though, is a little more refined and classy. He's still a racist tool bag, but he's a step short of where his colleagues are at. These are both movies that take place in the 1960s, so there's a couple uses of those 2 infamous N-words. The one that means black in Spanish, and the one that rhymes with bigger. And there's a scene where one Southern Democrat is ranting to his buddies about those N-words that rhyme with bigger, and Russell tells them to knock it off, not because it's offensive, but because that kind of talk is exactly what media outlets are looking for to discredit them about this whole no civil rights business. Russell is absolutely the furthest thing from a civil rights supporter, but he's also intelligent about his racism. These are both really good performances, but again, All the Way has the advantage here because it can go further in depth. There's a lot more scenes between Lyndon and Senator Russell there. You can instantly see how much affection Lyndon has for the man. He doesn't just respect Richard, he actively adores the man, to the point that he actively calls him Uncle Dick. Whereas Harrelson's Lyndon and Richard Jenkins' Russell feel more like longtime friends, or maybe even a younger brother and older brother. In both films, Lyndon often has dinner with Russell, but in LBJ, it looks like these dinners are just the 2 of them in Dick's home, while in All the Way, these dinners are between Lyndon and Dick and Lady Bird, and happen in the freaking White House. Think about how intimate that is. How many of your colleagues would you invite to your home to have dinner with you and your wife? Now imagine having to square off with that guy when you tell them that you're going to do everything in your power to make sure they fail at their one mission in life. In both versions of that scene, Lyndon tells Dick that he thinks the world of him. Woody's Lyndon tells Jenkins, Dick, that he's the finest man he knows, even if he's wrong about civil rights. While Cranston's Lyndon tells Langella's Dick that he loves him more than his own father. It's a much stronger relationship, which really adds to their conflict. And furthermore, while both versions of Richard or Russell are ready to throw down with Lyndon, I think All the Way adds to the character of Senator Russell more by having him be the one who starts their conflict. In LBJ, Lyndon flat out calls Dick a racist before the end of the film, and Dick gets pretty mad about it and says that he won't tolerate that kind of talk about him, even from the blasted president. And Lyndon says, then fight me, but not in a private argument behind closed doors, in the Senate halls where ideas always go to battle. In All the Way, though, when Russell finds out that Lyndon somehow snuck the Civil Rights Bill out of the House Committee, he immediately instigates the conflict with Lyndon, saying that he's starting to get too big for his britches. When Lyndon catches on to what Dick's on about, he tries to de-escalate the situation by saying they don't need to fight, but Dick replies, yes we do. Russell's past the point of being friendly. Lyndon has identified himself as his ideological opponent, and he will not yield to him. Mr. Jenkins, you're fantastic. but the point goes to all the way. While the films do feature 3 common characters besides Lyndon Johnson himself, they also feature a few other characters that don't appear in each other's films. John and Bobby Kennedy in LBJ, and Martin Luther King and Hubert Humphrey in All the Way, along with several other characters that I won't get into, or else we'll be here all day. John Kennedy, played by Jeffrey Donovan, and Hubert Humphrey, played by Bradley Whitford, basically serve the role of more or less enabling Lyndon in both films. Once in the White House, John openly states that his #1 goal with Lyndon is to just plain avoid making him his enemy. Lyndon Johnson used to be the most powerful Democrat in Washington. Now he has to take orders from his little brother and his little brother's old roommate from Harvard. Lyndon could easily come to resent his position and then start causing John problems in the press and around the globe. So John needs to keep the man happy, or else. Hubert is basically to Lyndon in All the Way what Lyndon is to John at the start of LBJ, minus a whole lot of power. Hubert is the leader of the Liberal Democratic Coalition, so he has a lot of pull with unions and civil rights people, so he's going to need their help to stay in office. Hubert is a fairly meek and somewhat nebbishy man. He doesn't like to raise his voice, and is quick to say he's on your side when you feel like nobody else is, more because of his own desire for value than a desire to show others that they are valued. But at the same time, they both have moments where they stand their ground against Lyndon. In LBJ, there's a scene where John's staff is pressuring him to draw up a civil rights bill, while Lyndon is screaming that if he tries to push that kind of legislation now, there is no way in hell it will ever pass. But John decides that the only right thing to do is to push for civil rights, and push for it now. And in All the Way, there's a scene where Lyndon is being told by his defense secretary that they need to ramp up the conflict in Vietnam, and Humphrey is doing his damnedest to convince Lyndon that this is a really, really, really bad idea. But Lyndon ignores him, and orders a few airstrikes over northern Vietnam. Hubert is a pretty good character in All the Way, and I'm definitely interested in doing some more reading on him, but I'd say Kennedy wins out thanks to his early scenes with Lyndon. In All the Way, it's pretty clear that Lyndon picks Hubert out of mostly political necessity, and any nice thing he says to him is mostly just an effort to butter him up so that he'll stay on board his campaign. But in LBJ, while Kennedy is motivated to pick Lyndon for pretty much the same reason, it also seems like they have a genuine mutual respect for each other. When Lyndon tries to say that the better man won the nomination, John brushes as that off and jokes that only the better looking man won. When Bobby gives John a hard time for picking Lyndon, citing the guy spent weeks trying to convince people that he has Addison's disease, John almost laughs and replies that he does have Addison's disease. Bobby is still viewing Lyndon as a potential threat to John, but John sees that the primaries are over and now he's converted a rival to his cause. It's a win-win. Point for LBJ. Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King mostly serve as Lyndon's opponents in the film. They both want the same thing as Lyndon, i.e. help John Kennedy be the president in LBJ and pass the Civil Rights Bill in All the Way, but the main difference between them is whether or not Bobby Kennedy really was a petty, petulant little prick. He really comes off like that in LBJ. Seriously, beyond pushing for the Civil Rights Bill before John died, we see him accomplish nothing as Attorney General, and we don't see what he actually contributes to John's campaign beyond just hyping him up and making sure Lyndon doesn't actually run, which he fails at considering that Lyndon did actually run. And when John dies, Bobby, the Attorney General, yells at Lyndon for wanting to prioritize the safety of the country and making sure that everything's running smoothly over just mourning John. I know you're grieving, Bobby, but you're still a damn public servant. The Soviets aren't gonna wait. Your allies aren't gonna wait. Nobody's gonna wait for you while you attend to your personal feelings. I get it, man, I really do, but this is your job. You need to put your feelings aside. Meanwhile, Dr. King is the complete opposite of Bobby. He knows that Lyndon has a million things on his plate and needs to play politics about the civil rights issue, so he's ready to play some ball with the guy. But when push comes to shove, he will prioritize his movement over his back and forth with Johnson. He's not exactly happy when Lyndon rips out the voting rights portion from the Civil Rights Bill, but he's willing to plead Lyndon's case to his fellow civil rights leader, and even opts to make a compromise with them. The folks who are content with what they're being offered for now will support the bill, and the folks who aren't will just stay quiet for now and focus on registering black voters in the meantime. Moreover, Dr. King knows how to make allies, and he knows how to squeeze them. When Lyndon locks up the Democratic nomination for himself and Hubert, King and his fellow civil rights leaders make a vocal campaign against Lyndon's opponent, Barry Goldwater. And when Lyndon wins the presidency on his own for the first time, thanks in large part to black voters, King and his fellow leaders agree that Johnson owes them big time, and they're going to hold his feet to the fire until he passes that damn voting rights bill. Point for All the Way. All the Way is the story of Lyndon Johnson's efforts to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, score the Democratic Party's nomination for the 1964 election, and then win that election with Hubert Humphrey as his vice president. LBJ more or less acts as a quasi-sequel to All the Way, chronicling the story of Lyndon Johnson immediately prior to his run against Kennedy in the Democratic primary for the 1960 presidential election, losing to him, and then being offered the vice presidency by John, much to Bobby's astonishment, and then being unable to accomplish much of anything as VP, and then witnessing Kennedy's death in Dallas, Texas in 1963, the oath of office on board Air Force One, and eventually delivering his first address to Congress on November 27th of that year. The main issue with the story in LBJ is that nothing really happens. Lyndon isn't pushing any especially noteworthy legislation through the Senate. Well, the majority leader, we don't see him really campaign for the Democratic nomination and explain why he thinks he'd be a better president than John. We see him attend an Oval Office meeting and a White House Council meeting, but nothing really comes of them. We don't see him in John's ear as the Democratic candidate or the president, save for one scene where he tries to argue against a civil rights bill because it would never pass, and John ignores him. And when John dies, we just see Lyndon try to position himself with his various aides and cabinet members, but he doesn't really accomplish anything aside from give his first big speech to Congress. He has a couple friendly and not so friendly debates with Dick Russell, but nothing comes of them. If you know the history, then you know what will happen, but what happens down the line isn't the subject of the story. Meanwhile, in All the Way, the story isn't about Lyndon Johnson's rise to power, it's about what LBJ did with that power. We see him argue with Dr. King about civil rights and what the bill will and won't do, and how much Johnson can do that's politically possible, and how much Dr. King is willing to wait for, and how much he's most definitely not prepared to wait for. We see him argue with Hubert about how far they can push the civil rights issue without alienating all of the Southern Democrats, and only most of them. There's a scene where Dr. King puts a black woman named Fannie Lou Hamer on TV at the Democratic National Convention. And she talks about how she was arrested, taken to jail, and then beaten viciously by two other black prisoners at the order of the white police officers until said prisoners were exhausted just because she was trying to help register black people to vote. The point of this little show from Dr. King is so that the DNC will be forced by the liberal Democrats to seat members of the Freedom Democratic Party, an offshoot of the main Democratic Party formed by Bob Moses, another civil rights leader. Lyndon immediately calls for a press conference despite having absolutely nothing to talk about, because if the Freedom Democrats have their way, all of the Southern Democrats will leave and he'll lose the nomination, and then the task of passing the voting rights bill will fall to a liberal Yankee who the Dixiecrats won't listen to at all, assuming the Democrats even win the presidency at all. And if it doesn't, then you wind up with Barry Goldwater, who doesn't support civil rights at all. This is a really exciting sequence because while you may not like what Lyndon is doing here, you can instantly understand why he does it. The Fanny story is horrific, and when Lyndon opts to upstage her, you're torn between hating him for disrespecting her trauma and admiring him for his cunning and quick thinking. LBJ's main issue is a lack of meaningful conflict. There's an antagonistic relationship between Lyndon and Bobby Kennedy, but nothing comes of it. There's a dramatic standoff between Lyndon and Senator Dick Russell at the end, but we don't see what comes of it, because the film ends before Lyndon's gotten to work on the Civil Rights Bill. Meanwhile, save for one scene where J. Edgar Hoover sends the infamous letter where the FBI posed as a black man and called out Dr. King and said that he should kill himself, every scene in All the Way has a payoff. That scene with Fannie Lou Hamer, it comes back around later when Hubert pitches to Dr. King Lyndon's offer. He'll allow for the DNC to suit 2 members of the Freedom Democratic Party so long as only one of the delegates is black and the other is Reverend James Reeb, a white member of the Civil Rights Movement. No one is especially crazy about the idea, but Dr. King tries to get everyone to go along with it by suggesting that lone black delegate be Fannie Lou Hamer. Neither Fannie nor Reverend James agree, though, and when word gets out that Johnson tried to put a black person in the convention, the delegates from Mississippi and Alabama walk out. The rest of the South, though, holds, thanks to Lyndon persuading the governor of Georgia to stay the course, and Lyndon eventually scores the nomination. The entire sequence proves Johnson right and shows how serious Southern political figures are about segregation. It doesn't matter if black people are even at the convention. The fact that Johnson and Humphrey tried to bring them in at all is bad enough. The final point goes to All the Way. So our final total is 1 point for LBJ and 6 points for All the Way. The best Lyndon Johnson movie ever. To be released in the year 2016. Thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this review. Feel free to like this video if you did, and then maybe check out a couple of the other historical films I've reviewed. I did a review for Hidden Figures last year, which took place in the middle of all this nonsense in LBJ, and I did a review for 2013's Fruitvale Station pretty recently. Or if you're in the mood for some historical fiction, preferably the down-to-earth variety, check out my last review for Richard Linklater's Last Flag Flying, which actually co-starred Cranston. Or if you want some high-concept stuff, check out my review for Zack Snyder's Watchmen. Or if your picky butt just wants something to talk about that's exciting, watch my review for 300. And then subscribe to my channel for my next series of reviews for the Mission Impossible franchise. Stay tuned, everyone. Woodstock, out.